So for more on this, we're joined by the CEO of SA Tourism, Themba Khumalo. Thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning and good morning to your viewers.
Mr. Khumalo, if we could just start, by just reflecting on the timing of this natural disaster. We've just come off the back of a devastating pandemic that has all but decimated the tourism industry. And then, just as we thought we were seeing a recovery, then this, and over the Easter period as well. Let's just reflect on what's been going on.
Well, thank you very much. First and foremost, my heart and our hearts go out to the people of KwaZulu Natal and all of the areas that have been adversely affected. I myself have got family in the province and I've been in constant communication with them. And this is just, unprecedented, in terms of its impact on the sector. In terms of the direct impact that has happened on the sector, it has happened, at a time when we've just come out of the COVID-19, pandemic. We started, the recovery process. We've got the tourism recovery, strategy that we've been driving, very effectively. And just as we thought we were coming out of the woods, this happens again. But we are resilient. We are South Africans. We are resilient as a sector. Our best comes out when our backs are actually against the wall. And I believe that if we focus and we band together, we will be able to recover from this eventually.
So let's look at KwaZulu Natal. For many years, considered the #1 playground for South Africans because of the fabulous weather all year round in a city like Durban. So if we look at what happened, and as we said, this as people were preparing to go on holiday in the province over the Easter break, what are some of the frustrations that you've heard from travelers, especially those who went anyway? And we saw some of them with our reporters, speaking to our reporters last week. The beaches were closed, movement was limited due to some of the infrastructure damage. But what are people saying?
So firstly, what we did when we realized, the extent of, the damages, we deployed a very senior team onto the ground in Durban in order for us to have, a direct assessment working together with Tourism KZN and the city's JOC in order for us to really get first-hand information. And the first thing that I must say about, to commend the city is that there were plans that were already in place to anticipate the influx of tourists over the Easter period. So all of the redundancy, supply systems and bulk services were in place in order for the city to be able to, to deal with that influx. But what happened is with the severity of, of the impact, it happened in areas that are outside of the core. So one of the things that we do know is that in the areas where, for example, we, intend to be hosting the, Africa's, travel Indaba from the 2nd to the 5th of May, that infrastructure is still in place, but the areas that are affected are the areas that are, outside of the core. And therefore, the frustration that we, most of the travelers are having is being able to move from those areas into where the core infrastructure, is still intact. But I, have been in touch with the team, as I said, on the ground. And, I am fully persuaded that in the coming days, as resilient South Africans, we will be able to pull together. We will be able to still host, Africa's travel Indaba on the 2nd to the 5th of May. That all of the efforts are starting now to clean out all of the, the beach areas, to clean out, some of the core areas, where tourism occurs. And I believe that over the next couple of days, we will be able to restore, the core tourism infrastructure areas to be able to get the activities of tourism back on track.
Mr. Khumalo, what about the hotels and other entertainment spaces in KZN and especially in eThekwini? What are their frustrations at the moment?
Well, I think, one of the major issues from a supplier standpoint, from the hotels, standpoint, is that because of the images that have been going around, which are, real, I mean, they're reflective of what's happening on the ground, is that there might be, a temptation, for travelers to cancel, their trips into the area, and that would have an adverse economic impact, on the sector. The most, patriotic, the most, compassionate way to respond to, the people of, KZN and the tourism sector, that has been affected, is not actually to pull back. It is actually to recommit. It is actually to make sure that the economic activity in the area continues, so that the businesses that are affected can get an economic injection and begin to to recover in the short term. So I'd like to urge those that have had bookings that are in areas that have not been adversely affected to still continue to travel to the area in order for that economic recovery to occur in the area. It is much needed at this time. We need to come together in order to pull the sector together rather than to take a step back. And that is my earnest appeal.
So, I beg your pardon, just in terms of the assistance in that regard, would it perhaps not be helpful to publish a pamphlet or a booklet of sorts that would show your travelers exactly which areas have been affected and which areas, they can still go and enjoy a holiday in that were perhaps not as adversely affected as others in the province?
Absolutely. So we've been working together with our partners. We have pulled together, and it will be shared shortly, a live dashboard, so that tourists can see the affected areas in real time. It's important that we make that information available. We're working together with the geo mapping companies and telcos to make sure that we're able to get that information out in real time. So you're absolutely 100% correct. That is, in fact, what is required. Speaking about relief to the businesses that have been affected, we operate within a governed environment. So we are exploring all legal instruments, and compliance instruments to see how we can bring relief within the confines of the laws of the country.
So apart from that, Mr. Khumalo, because as you said, the travel Indaba, that will be going ahead. That's the first week of May. So in which other ways will you be assisting the province and, of course, tourism in that province to recover?
So, as I said, we have deployed a senior team onto the ground in the short term. We're working together with KZN Tourism on the ground, and also with the city's JOC, and also with all of the authorities and our bid partners on the ground. That information, obviously, we've been working, and as I said, we're looking at all of the legal instruments that are available to us. We've just come out of a long weekend, and in the coming days, I think we'll be able to substantively, respond to that one. We've got to be careful, over this period to make sure that as we respond in the crisis, we respond, within the boundaries of the laws of the country. Thank you.
And then, of course, that focus is obviously on the flood-ravaged areas that we are talking about. But there is, of course, beyond that, still a whole province that's open. And, of course, the country by extension. And let's talk about that, especially in the aftermath, or it's not quite the aftermath, but we are starting to come out of, the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Khumalo.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'm glad you asked that question. So, across all of the country, working together with all of the provincial tourism authorities, we have got very comprehensive marketing, programs that we're driving in order for us to get both international tourists in, and also to get domestic tourism, to restart, in earnest over this period. As you know, one of the biggest areas, the biggest, contributor to our international arrivals is the African continent. So, Africa's Travel Indaba, which is an African show, is the cornerstone of that to begin to kickstart that process. But we've also launched our global brand campaign, which is our Live Again, campaign, which we launched in February. And that, we're rolling out in all of our key source markets around the world. We're also working with all of the international airlines in order to recover some of the airlift, that, was lost during, the COVID-19 period, because it's important that as we drive demand on, in the source markets, that you actually have the airlift in order to bring people into the country, either directly or through, the key hubs, around the world, like Dubai, like, Ethiopia, and through West Africa, into the South African market. So all of those programs, we've got very excellent, diligent South African colleagues on the ground in each of our, our source markets around the world, working together with our international relations, our colleagues to really, really, really drive that demand. And we're beginning to see the response, from all of the international, travel trade. We're also working, very effectively with Tourism Business Council, which, and other, industry bodies on the supply side to make sure that as tourists come in, we have the product in order to be able to respond. Yes, in terms of the areas that have been affected, we need to isolate that and look at that particular recovery. But in the rest of the country that is not affected, we are gearing up in order to make sure that we're able to meet that demand. And between myself and, my colleague, Chifiwa at, TBCSA, we've been working very, closely to make sure that we're able to respond to that demand.
And just with regard to the uptick in tourist numbers, especially from elsewhere on the continent or elsewhere internationally, are we actually seeing those numbers rise, Mr. Khumalo?
Yes, we're seeing those numbers rise. And let me also say something else. It's important for South Africans also to travel onto the continent. Absolutely critical. Because, as we expect other African countries to travel towards us, there also needs to be an increase in South African travel onto the continent. It is when we travel to one another that we begin to understand one another better. It is when we begin to appreciate one another better, and it makes the flow of tourism a lot more effective. So as I, respond to your question to say, yes, we're getting an uptake in numbers coming off from the continent, but I'd also like to see an uptake in South Africans traveling onto the continent so that we begin to build a robust African tourism, a market. That is more important in the long run. As we saw during the lockdown, we had to rely on our domestic tourism in order for us to, to sustain the tourism sector, domestically. But as we begin to recover from an international, perspective, we need to also make sure that the regional tourism, begins, to grow and creates a base of resilience. So that's why, Africa's Travel Indaba is so important, because it is an African show as opposed to just being a South African show. It's just hosted in South Africa, but it is an African show, and that is why it's important that we sustain it.
And just finally, Mr. Khumalo, speaking about domestic tourism, one of the upshoots, if you will, that came as a result of the pandemic was, of course, the cost of tourism that was very affordable for the local market and to facilitate domestic tourism. What about going forward? Is that something that you, as the CEO of SA Tourism, along with your counterparts, will be looking into? Because very often this is something that locals complain about, just the cost of domestic tourism, especially in some places that are clearly pegged and marked for an overseas target market and not for locals.
I'm glad you asked that question. So, in the middle of, the lockdown period, and as we began to recover, tourism, I think it was an opportunity for everyone, to go through a reconsideration of, business models, a reconsideration of target markets, a reconsideration even of product mix. So, it's not just a pricing issue, because tourism, has got a lot of, support industries that impact it. So if fuel goes up, it will impact, tourism. If bread goes up, it will impact tourism, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the input costs into the pricing of tourism, need to be taken into account. But there's also a segmentation issue that says we need to have a product, supply side that understands that the needs of the different segments of the market need to be catered for in different kinds of ways. And this is not a quality issue. It is a positioning issue and a fit for purpose issue. And I believe that with the discussions that have been happening and the innovation that has happened during the lockdown, new products has actually emerged. So that the product supply side is not what it was when we went into lockdown. The pricings, have been reviewed, and also the product offering itself. We've got new hotel groups, that were born in the middle of, the pandemic. We've got new, guest house, categories that have emerged. We've got new entertainment platforms that didn't exist that, came up, during, the lockdown period. So as we go back into, marketing domestically, continentally, and internationally, there's actually a renewed offering that the Live Again campaign is taking forward. So I believe that we are actually ready and we're better posed in order for us to recover. There will obviously remain segments that will be targeting certain international, travelers that will keep their pricing and the positioning in that respect. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Those businesses must continue to operate in that manner.
And certainly looking forward to that, because this is a beautiful country and there are still a few bucket list items for me to tick off. I think of the Namakwa flowers, that particular event on my bucket list. I wanted to do it last year, didn't quite happen, but hopefully this year it's something that will happen. Tsitsikamma, so many beautiful places in this country. But CEO of SA Tourism, Themba Khumalo, thanks so much for speaking to us, and hopefully we'll see that recovery in KZN. But of course, the rest of South Africa open for tourism. So that was the CEO of SA Tourism.